welcome to Canonical. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by Iad Darris and Sam Spiller.
Hey.
Hello.
Hello. Today we are reviewing the first book in our series on contemporary Nigerian fiction with Awkwaeke Emezi's The Death of Vivek Oji. If this is your first time joining us, we are a literary book club on Reddit. You can join our discussion on Reddit by clicking on the link in the episode description. You can also support us in your local bookstore by using our bookshop.org link. That's also in the episode description. We are also on social media at Canonical Pod. Next week, we will have an in-depth discussion of this book with spoilers. We hope you'll join us for that episode as well. So yet, our listeners might wonder, why are we doing a series on Nigerian literature?
For the past few years, people have been talking about a kind of renaissance in Nigerian fiction. I think a better way to think about it is a redirection, because Nigerian fiction has always been there, but the change I'm hearing about now is a turn inwards. It's a turn away from being selected and published by foreigners on the basis of quote-unquote historical significance. Bibi Bakari Yusuf, a Nigerian publisher at a press called Cassava Republic, said, "One of the things that we are trying to do is expand the definition of African literature. Achebe's Things Fall Apart cannot define the whole continent." So in this series, what I'm looking for is how the stories we are going to read have become more personal and more specific to Nigerian readers, and also how that will relate to us as non-Nigerians.
We'll start our series with this book, The Death of Vivek Oji. This is Awkwaeke Emezi's second book. Their first book, Freshwater, was nominated for a number of awards. This book came out just last year, I believe summer of last year, and I picked this book because I was quite interested, I suppose, in Emezi's story. They are a non-binary trans writer living now, I believe, in New Orleans, and they studied at NYU. Their story, because of how singular and unique it is, made them very interesting for me, just because there is this perception, and I think it is true, that Nigeria is very conservative, sexually and culturally. So I was quite curious to see what this kind of tension might create in fiction.
I think Emezi is going to become more prominent. I think that they have already become quite notable in the literary scene, especially among Nigerian and Nigerian expat authors. And their persona and their voice is really unique, as you mentioned. So I think that, this is definitely the last time that we're going to hear from Emezi.
This book is told from multiple points of view. The novel begins with the death of Vivek Oji, as the title says, and superficially it's structured like a murder mystery. But I would say it's not really a murder mystery. It's more of a coming-of-age story of young Nigerians who live in a society where defying traditional gender norms can result in tragedy and violence.
You're not going to call it a whodunit? Oh man, I was waiting.
I guess it is a whodunit. But once again, it's not really a murder mystery. That's not the point of the book. And so I would say that is not the takeaway. If you read this book for the whodunit, you'd probably be pretty disappointed.
I do think, though, that the death is central. And even though we know that it happens from the beginning of the novel, the circumstances are unclear throughout, and not knowing that is the central intrigue of the novel.
Yeah, I agree. I think the death is very central to the book, except I would say thematically, or at least in my appreciation of the book, it's not the most important thing. I thought this novel was a strong example of contemporary literary fiction. Emezi takes risks with structure and language. These risks were not especially surprising, and they don't always pay off, but they do take these risks. The structure feels a bit loose and uncontrolled at times, especially in the middle, where I thought much of the tension was lost. And the sentences, they're kind of hit or miss. When they miss, they feel overly written and overly sentimental because this book is about someone dying. However, even with these shortcomings, I suspect that this novel will remain with me for a long time. And that's not something I say lightly because a lot of the books we've read recently, honestly, I just forget about them once we finish reading the next book. I think all of the last three, I don't remember much about them. The reason why I think this book might stay with me is there's a freshness in the writing here. And it's not actually in the depiction of non binary identity, which, while rare in fiction, doesn't really present anything new to me, at least, but rather because of everything else in the book, actually. The setting, the sex, the character's epilepsy, for example, the vivid imagery. There are so many different parts of this book that kind of stand out and kind of shimmer. So, even though I found this book to be just kind of okay overall as a read, I appreciate the verve in the writing, the risks that they took with this book.
What is verve? I mean, I have a sense, but I'm not really sure what you mean by verve.
Some writers are very safe. They write honestly boring prose, functional prose. Emezi is not that kind of writer. I think they take a lot of risks, and I appreciate that because it's actually quite easy to write clean, minimalist prose. I would not say that Emezi's fiction is like that. I would say Emezi will take a risk with perhaps over describing a scene, will take a risk with more dramatic juxtapositions of sentences. For example, the structure, it's a risky structure and it's not entirely successful, but I appreciate the attempt. It could have been done in a much more traditional way.
I think I agree about a lot of that, especially with setting and describing the setting. I didn't feel like their language was that interesting. I guess I see what you mean about risks. In some ways, I feel like they could have taken more risks, but I would worry that it would be more sentimental if that were the case. But on the other hand, I think Emezi does a good job with voice, especially since we're inside the heads of different characters at different times. There are definite weaknesses, but yeah, I think the vivid imagery that you talked about, even though I wouldn't call their writing evocative necessarily, I think that is what will end up staying with me over time.
I think it has the appearance of something that should be luxurious or sensual or tactile. And it has that kind of appearance on the page because when you read it, it's very sensual, the language that they use. But it doesn't work for me as a reader. And it's troubling, especially for me, because it leaves me feeling very cold and it leaves me feeling like I'm missing out on some shared experience or shared understanding that other readers will have. It's written in these kinds of sentences where it's clearly meant to be very earthy and bodily and emotional. And when it doesn't work, you just end up feeling like a robot. And maybe I am a little bit of a robot when it comes to my appreciation of this book, but it just didn't work for me in terms of beautiful language. But I could see that that's what they were going for.
We will, I'm sure, talk more about recommendation later. But when I was trying to describe this to a friend this past week, I couldn't help but note that almost everywhere I read about the book was glowing in praise. And I don't think they're wrong, but I also, like you, Iad, I don't fully see it. I don't think it's bad by any stretch. I think this is a good book, but I wanted it to be better than that. I wanted it to be great, and I couldn't quite get there.
Uh, like James, I also have a problem with the pacing and the structure of the novel. I think the structure could have been done well. And I also think that taking this risk is good. I applaud that. But I found that there is a lot of interest in the beginning of the novel when the main characters are introduced. And there's also a lot of interest at the end of the novel where some of the main questions are resolved. But there's a big chunk in the middle which is very flaccid and dull. And I couldn't really maintain my interest throughout. I don't think it's a boring novel. It doesn't overstay its welcome, but I feel like it could have been tightened up, especially in the middle.
Do you think that's because we go back in time a lot? If you can, without getting into spoilers too much, what do you think it is about the middle section?
It's not moving backwards in time. The nonlinear narrative is fine. I think that that was done pretty well. I think what it is that nothing new is added. All of the main pieces of the puzzle are laid out for you at the beginning, and you kind of know what's going to happen and how things are working. You don't know exactly what will happen until the very end, but there is no new element added in the middle, and the existing elements aren't enough to sustain my interest.
How you just described it is partly what I had trouble with when it comes to the mystery, because we are given all of the pieces for the most part at the very beginning. And I took what I thought was kind of a wild stab at the answer for the mystery and spent the entire novel wondering if I was right. And then it turns out that I was. I do that a lot with mysteries, but I'm not always correct. And being correct doesn't necessarily make it a bad book, just not as great a mystery as it could have been. But I wonder if that is part of it too, is that we have all the pieces, even if it was still a surprise, like you said, no new information is really given in the middle.
There is one thing that comes out of the middle of the novel. There is a character who is introduced, and we focus very exclusively on him for just one section in the middle, and then he feels absent, and he just feels like something just thrown on top. And I think we'll probably talk more about him in more detail in the next episode when we can have some spoilers. But that was the one new thing that was added to the middle of the novel, and I don't think it was substantial. I think the middle of the novel is mostly exploring the interrelationships of the characters that we've been introduced to in the beginning, and it didn't matter so much to me. These characters are mostly young people, and it's a lot of discussion of their personal lives and how they feel about each other. And I know this is a dirty word on our show, but it reminded me a lot of Vagabonds. It was a lot of talking about the characters and how they feel, and none of it was earned, really. I feel like a lot of it was just like, this guy's sad, that guy's sad, but I don't really know them or care that much about them yet. You have to show me more in order for me to be invested in their emotions.
Vagabonds was a book for our Chinese science fiction series, a book that we panned.
Yeah. That has been reviewed since highly for whatever reason. You are talking around this character very carefully, this character that's introduced and then we don't see anymore afterward. Um, the reason why I want to bring him up again is that the way you spoke makes it sound like he's really important to the mystery, when really he's not. So we could even talk about him now, and it really wouldn't spoil anything. That's how odd it felt in the center of the book.
Are we talking about the guy who works at the market?
Ebenezer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
His wife works at the market. He works fixing tires.
Right.
I think it's better than Vagabonds. I think there's more here. I'm conflicted. For me, the gender identity in this book, even though it's so central, it's actually honestly like one of the least interesting things about this book.
I think that may expose a little bit about why you didn't respond as positively to this novel as some of the other reviewers do, because I don't really have as strong an interest as others do in non-binary identities, but I recognize with this novel that that is the main attraction. And if that doesn't matter to you very much, you're at the wrong show. So for us to pan this novel, which I don't even think we're doing, because I still think
No.
it has something to recommend it, but I just don't think it's as interesting to me because that particular topic is not something that I am especially interested in. I think that for readers more invested in that subject matter, it will be sustaining over the course of not just one or two, but several novels. So I don't know if that's an objective problem with the work or if it's just something specific to us as a group of readers.
I don't know. I mean, I was definitely drawn to the subject matter. So that I don't think was the issue for me. But I don't have a great explanation for why I didn't fall in love the way so many reviewers did.
I mean, you'd look at someone like Morrison who writes about black women, right, in every
Hmm.
book, but you never think, oh, this is just about black women. When you read her work, you get the feeling that it's about something more. That's what I think is missing from this book, is that it doesn't ever really get beyond the point of this binary identity that's at the center of the novel.
I feel like that it does take shots at other things though. But maybe that's part of the issue is that it takes shots, but the shots don't necessarily land. For example, with the Ebenezer character, I feel like they're saying something there, but I don't quite know what it is.
I think that Emezi has more to say, not just about gender issues. This is something that we'll talk about in the next episode when we're out of spoiler territory, but I do think that they have something to say about other aspects of Nigerian society, but I just don't know that they have articulated it as completely as they could have. I think that it has the seeds of a stronger novel, but it's not elaborated enough yet. I think that this is the potential for them to grow to really dig in and show how all of these things intersect with each other.
So this kind of brings me back to The Verve. That's why I'm actually very interested in reading their sixth novel. Because for me, this writer is someone who will take risks, someone who is willing to look at tension and conflict in interesting ways, present images in interesting ways. When I finished reading this book, I thought, okay, like, I want to read something by this writer in like 10 years. Because right now, when I finished it, I was a little bit disappointed. So that's where I'm at. The book itself is fine. I thought it was good, but
Yeah.
it didn't knock my socks off or anything. Oh, by the way, I would totally recommend the audiobook. That was a delight to listen to. I listened to the first third of the book via audiobook. It's really good. I think I told you, Sam, that it felt like the reader was seducing me.
Yeah, I listened to part of it as well, and it is very good. You get a little bit of this by reading it. Hearing it does a really good job of hearing how the English language works in Nigeria. Because this was written in English, but there are definitely things that are particular to Nigeria, phrases in the language, and Emezi captures that really well. And I think hearing it is kind of delightful.
I kind of wished that I had listened to the whole book on audiobook because when I stopped listening was when I stopped liking the book as much.
Hmm.
And then the ending was good. I thought the last maybe one fourth was fine. But that middle, man, that middle really bogged down.
This talk kind of reminds me of a conversation we had a while back, and I don't remember what book it was about. It might have been Stoner. There are books that are very tight and clean and spotless, but maybe a little bit more rigid because of that. And then there are books that are not as tidy, not as cleanly written, but are expansive in other ways. And I feel like this is the latter, where there are things that could have been cleaned up. But that kind of gives the writer space to breathe and play.
I kind of regret not picking Freshwater. I was really trying to decide between the two books, and I went for this one because it was more of a murder mystery, or so it was, described.
Freshwater does sound like it was pretty good. I'm curious about it.
All right, we'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll talk about who we would recommend this book to. We'll be right back. Welcome back. So, would you recommend this book? And who would you recommend it to if you would recommend this book?
I would. I think I was just recently listening to our episode about Julia Otsuka's The Buddha in the Attic. And James, the point you made there is that we are just one type of reader, and there are other readers who have different goals and different things that they want. I would recommend this book to other people because I know that even though this book didn't resonate with me, there are a lot of people out there who would really enjoy it. And I think that for people who are interested in non-binary people and people who are interested in African and Nigerian fiction, this is really of singular interest to them. So I think this is really the definite pick for those kinds of people.
I agree. I would recommend this to just about everyone.
Turfs.
Turfs. I'd probably recommend it to J.K. Rowling.
There's magic here.
There is magic here.
Maybe?
Which we'll talk about next episode.
Yeah, we kind of just glossed right over all the semi-supernatural aspects of the novel.
Yeah.
It's not very supernatural. Honestly, more interesting to me than the non-binary identity theme of the book.
Well, I'm going to ask you about that next episode.
What about you, James?
Yeah, this book, like you said, is very similar to The Buddha in the Attic for me. I think it would have the same readership. And that happens to be the readership that buys most of the literary fiction. So,
well, as we pointed out with that book, that felt like a very book club book. I think this falls into that category too.
yeah. I've picked 3 of them now, by the way. The other one is Britt Bennett's book. 3 books that are very book clubby books. I'm just going to go back to sci-fi for a while.
Here's the thing, though. This is a quote-unquote important book. And I particularly didn't really love this book. I thought it was just okay, but I still was willing to recommend it. And the two of you as well, we didn't have a lot of positive things to say about it, but we still would recommend it. So I'm just wondering how much it being a quote unquote important book plays into that.
Well, I thought it was a fine book. I thought it was good. Out of 10, maybe, what, a 6 or 7? It's better written than a lot of other books. It's just not something I'm excited about, but it's a fine book.
Yeah, as I said earlier, I think it's a good book. I didn't think it was a great book, but it's good. I definitely enjoyed it.
Let me ask a different kind of question. I'd like to move on a bit from here. Is this a book that would change minds? If you give this to someone who's transphobic, if they get through this book, do you think they would gain some kind of understanding, some kind of empathy, or no?
I don't know, But I will say that when I was looking up reviews, I did see it on what appeared to be a very Christian site, and they were all about it. They really enjoyed it, whoever was reviewing it. There's a lot of progressive Christians out there, so that doesn't mean anything on its own, but I was still surprised. I don't know if it'll change minds. It doesn't feel especially strong in that regard, but I wouldn't say that it certainly won't.
I would say not, because the tragic character, Vivek Oji, is not sympathetic enough. We don't know him as a relatable person. He is too inscrutable, too mysterious, too supernatural. We can't see him and feel like his death is as significant as the death of another person, only because we don't see him as a normal person. And I don't think that's an accident. I think that Emezi writes him that way on purpose, but I think that in terms of changing hearts and minds, it makes him less useful as a character.
All right, let's stop here. We've got a lot more to talk about next episode when we can talk about all the spoilers in this novel. If you thought we were off base with our review of this book, you can let us know once again on Reddit. That link is below. We are also on social media at Canonical Pod. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give us a nice review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. Next week, we'll be back with an in-depth discussion of the death of Vivek Oji. If you're interested in joining that discussion, go ahead and find a copy of this book. It's not super long. It's about 250 pages. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.